1 hour before his wedding, the millionaire CEO walked into his office not to write vows, but to search for something he couldn't name. And when the elevator broke down on the 17th floor, he was trapped with the one woman he was never supposed to love. Claire Donovan had been his secretary for 5 years. 5 years of stolen glances, of silent care, of pretending. She typed the wedding invitations he was about to hand out. She ironed the suit he would wear walking down the aisle. But she never said a word until that day. Why did Richard Walker, a man who always had a plan, suddenly risk everything just for 1 hour of truth? What happens when you finally choose love, but too late and in the silence of a broken elevator? What secrets come alive? This is not a story about betrayal. It's about timing, regret, bravery, and the love that waits quietly behind closed doors. If you believe in second chances, real love, and the beauty of choosing with your whole heart, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. Claire Donovan sat at her desk on the 27th floor, watching the morning light spill across a silk navy blue dress she would wear today to the wedding of the man she loved in silence. The city was still waking up. Charleston's spring air had that soft, honeyed hue it wore in April, when the mornings held just enough chill to kiss the windows, but not enough to keep coats on for long. The office, usually filled with the hum of printers and clipped heels, was nearly silent, just the occasional groan of old pipes behind the walls, and the low whoosh of the central air. It was a Saturday. No one was supposed to be here. No one but her. Claire had let herself in just after 8, using her personal code. She hadn't planned on staying long, just a few things to finalize, a few email threads to close before she disappeared into the background of Richard Walker's wedding day, a day she'd known about for months, a day she had printed menus for, typed speeches for, helped coordinate hotel blocks and dietary preferences for, the day her heart had been slowly preparing itself to break. The navy blue dress hung on the back of her chair like a ghost. Simple, elegant, chosen with painful care. She had tried on 13 dresses before settling on that one long sleeves, a modest neckline, a soft shimmer in the fabric when she moved. Not too bold, not too forgettable. Something safe, something invisible. She had no business being at the ceremony, but she was invited. Of course she was invited. She had been there through every step of the planning, every draft of the guest list, every conversation Richard had rehearsed before calling Melissa's father. Claire had typed the very first email that had set the wedding into motion, and yet the invitation had still surprised her when it arrived. Handwritten envelope, embossed cardstock, her name written with care, Ms. Claire Donovan, guest of Walker and Lane. A courtesy, perhaps, or maybe worse, an obligation. She looked down at the stack of reports on her desk, the quarterly forecast for the Atlanta project that Richard had casually asked about the day before. He wouldn't read them today or tomorrow, maybe not for a week, but she had promised herself she'd finish them. Work, at least, had always been safe, predictable, a container for all the feelings she didn't know how to carry. Through the tall windows, the sounds of the city began to rise, car doors slamming shut, laughter bouncing between buildings, music wafting up from the plaza 3 stories below. Claire stood and stepped toward the glass, arms crossed loosely, shoulders tight. The square in front of the Walker and Lane building had been transformed overnight, white folding chairs in tidy rows, a long floral arch at the center, everything timed down to the minute. Someone was checking microphones. The hum of feedback echoed faintly up the glass. She saw a florist crouched near the arch, tucking something into place. Pale blush roses, blue thistle, sprigs of rosemary for remembrance. Her throat tightened. Claire pressed her hand against the window, as if she could push the whole scene away. But there it was, unmistakable. This wasn't a dream. Richard was getting married, not to her, not to the woman who had worked beside him for 5 years. Who knew how he took his coffee and when his shoulder pain flared up from too much tennis? Not to the woman who had rewritten his speeches, booked his flights, walked his dog when his meetings ran long. Not to the woman who had memorized the way his voice dropped when he was tired, who had learned to see the sadness behind his eyes when no one else noticed. No, he was marrying Melissa Harrington, the perfect match, the political union, the beautiful camera-ready daughter of a U.S. senator, the kind of woman who fit beside a man like Richard in every way that counted. On paper. Claire took a breath, then returned to her desk. She adjusted the spine of the report, smoothed the page with her palm. The dress rustled slightly as she sat down again, brushing against the back of her legs. She checked the time, 10:14 a.m. The ceremony would begin at noon. If she left by 11:15, she could make it, slip into the back row, smile politely, and leave before the champagne was served. No one would notice her arrival or her exit. That was her superpower. Her phone buzzed, cutting through the hush. She glanced at the screen. A message from Jenna in accounting. FYI, he just got here. Said he needed something from his office. Elevator's heading up. Claire stared at the message, reading it twice, then a third time. Her first reaction wasn't panic or surprise. It was stillness, as if the air had thickened, and she was moving through syrup. Richard, here, on the morning of his wedding. What could he possibly need from his office? A file, a distraction, a moment alone. The elevator dinged somewhere below. Her breath caught in her chest. She turned toward the glass again, her reflection faint in the sunlit window. Her fingers reached up, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. She hadn't even put on makeup yet, hadn't tried to look presentable, hadn't expected another ding. Closer now, louder. She stood up. Her knees felt unsteady, like they remembered something her heart hadn't caught up to yet. And then, quiet. The subtle, unmistakable sound of the elevator doors opening on her floor. There were 5 birthdays, 2 promotions, a surgery, and 1 snowstorm between them, and not a single confession. 5 years of quiet moments, 5 years of polite nods in elevators, of coffee cups passed between desks, of carefully worded emails that said just enough, but never too much. 5 years where Claire Donovan stood just outside the edge of something she dared not name. From the day she started as Richard Walker's executive assistant, there had been a stillness between them, not an absence, no, but something like a lake just before dawn, the kind of silence that holds its breath. At first, she thought it was just professionalism. He was guarded, brilliant, driven. But as weeks turned into months, that silence began to feel like an understanding, a language they shared, spoken in glances and small, unrepeatable moments. Claire had seen how Richard was with others, decisive, composed, always 5 steps ahead. But with her, he paused, just slightly, enough that she noticed. There was a time, early on, when she'd brushed it off as her imagination. But then came the late nights. The first was during the annual Investor Summit prep. They'd stayed past midnight, rewriting slides, adjusting budgets. He brought her a blanket when the office temperature dropped. Didn't ask, just left it on the back of her chair. That night, she caught him watching her as she laughed at a typo in a graph title. His expression wasn't amusement, it was wonder, like he'd forgotten for a moment that she was his assistant. She hadn't slept much that night, and when the sun rose and life returned to normal, she filed that look away into a drawer marked, "Don't open." There were birthdays. He always remembered hers. Not just remembered, acknowledged in ways no one else did. 1 year. He left a wrapped book on her desk. Inside the cover, a note, for quiet days and good stories. It was a collection of essays about architecture and memory. He had once overheard her say she'd wanted to be an architect before life shifted her course. On his birthday, she would leave a card on his desk before he arrived, always unsigned, always from the office, but with handwriting that was unmistakably hers. She didn't know if he knew. She hoped he did. Then came the flu that turned into pneumonia. Claire hadn't told anyone how sick she'd gotten, But on the third day of radio silence, there was a knock on her door. When she opened it, pale, bundled in the flannel, and shame, Richard stood there with a paper bag of soup and a bottle of ginger ale. He didn't stay long. He sat at the edge of the couch while she tried to pretend she didn't feel like a ghost. He told her Walter, her rescue dog, looked skeptical of him, but not unfriendly. He fed Walter a treat from his pocket like he'd done it before. She didn't ask how he knew what Walter liked. Before he left, he handed her a small packet of lemon cough drops, the kind she always kept in her desk. "Thank you," she'd whispered. He nodded once and was gone. Later that night, in the haze of fever, she dreamed she had kissed him. The warmth of his palm on her cheek lingered long after she woke. She never told anyone. There was that snowstorm 2 winters ago, the rare kind that Charleston wasn't prepared for. The office closed early, but Claire had stayed late to finish a quarterly review. By the time she looked outside, the streets were slick and nearly deserted. Her car was blocked by a snowdrift. When Richard offered her a ride home, she hesitated, but she said yes. He drove slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift. She remembered thinking how calm he looked, how natural he seemed beside her in the quiet of the car. When they reached her apartment, he didn't ask to come in, just waited until she was inside before pulling away. The next morning, she found a message in her inbox. "Glad you got home safe." That was all. Every year, he asked about Walter. Not out of obligation, he remembered details. How the dog hated thunderstorms. How he'd had surgery on his hip. How Claire had nearly canceled a vacation when Walter fell ill. Those weren't things most people remembered, but Richard did. She wondered, sometimes, how he managed to forget everything else. The moments were never spoken of again. Not directly, but they lived in the spaces between their words. The glances held a second too long. The way his hand would rest briefly on the small of her back when guiding her through a crowded room. The way he always stood when she entered. It was a relationship without definition, not romantic, not merely professional, something else, something deeper, something braver, if only either of them had the courage to name it. Then came the day she would never forget, the day he told her he was getting engaged. She had just returned from a meeting with legal. He'd called her into his office calm, unreadable as ever. "I'd like you to draft an internal announcement," he'd said, handing her a handwritten note. "Melissa and I are engaged. It'll be public by tomorrow, but I'd like our team to hear it from me." Claire had nodded, smiled. She always smiled. "Congratulations," she had said, like a reflex. She typed the email later that night, alone in the office. She included the words delighted to share and excited for the future. She hit send, then opened a new document, the guest list spreadsheet. 2 weeks later, she was handed the print materials for the wedding. She was to proofread the programs, double-check the RSVP system, confirm the final guest count. She did all of it, quietly, perfectly, without mistake. She even designed the seating chart. And when the invitations were delivered, she took one home. She didn't open it, just placed it in the back of her closet with the other paper things she couldn't bear to throw away. Now, sitting at her desk, 5 years of silent love wrapped tightly in her chest. Claire looked up as the elevator chimed. The soft, mechanical ding echoed through the nearly empty office. She stood before she thought about it, smoothing her blouse with one hand. She turned toward the sound, knowing who it would be. Richard Walker stepped into view. He wore a dark suit, tailored to precision, his tie still undone, a folder in his hand, posture relaxed, expression unreadable. He didn't speak right away, neither did she. Claire rose to her feet, feeling suddenly younger and older at the same time. Her smile came without effort, but also without ease. It was the smile she wore for things she couldn't change. The elevator jolted between the 17th and 18th floors, and the world held its breath. Claire felt it before she registered it, a subtle lurch, a sharp metal groan, then stillness. Her hand reached instinctively for the railing behind her, fingers wrapping tightly around the cool brass. Above them, the lights flickered once, then again, and finally settled into the soft, unsettling hue of emergency red. The digital floor display blinked, then froze 17.5. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Claire could hear the soft hum of the elevator's fan overhead and the quiet tick of her own wristwatch. Time had paused, but only inside this metal box. Richard reached toward the panel, pressing the emergency call button with practiced calm. A buzz, a pause. Then the voice of a security operator crackled through the speaker. There had been a system-wide malfunction. Power fluctuation. Elevator systems locked automatically for safety. Estimated reset time, 90 minutes, possibly longer. They would not be pried out. Not quickly, not dangerously. Patience was the safest choice. Claire stepped back into the center of the elevator, her arms crossing reflexively over her chest. The air wasn't cold, but her skin tingled as if it were. "I guess," she said softly. "We wait." Richard nodded once, sliding the folder he carried beneath his arm. He didn't look annoyed, not even frustrated. If anything, he looked steady. Claire studied his profile for a beat longer than she should have. No fidgeting, no checking his phone, no murmured expletives or frantic finger taps against the wall. This wasn't how a man behaved when trapped on his wedding day. "What did you come back for?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. He looked at her, almost startled, then softened. "My father's watch," he said. "He gave it to me before he passed. I plan to wear it today. It was in the bottom drawer of my office. I meant to bring it home days ago." Claire nodded, absorbing the layers beneath his words. Richard rarely spoke about his father. When he did, it was careful, measured, like pulling a thread from cloth he wasn't ready to unravel. She leaned back against the wall, letting the silence stretch. Outside the elevator, life carried on. Somewhere below, wedding planners would be reviewing final checklists. Ushers would be lining up, florists fluffing centerpieces, musicians tuning instruments. Time moved forward, just not for them. She watched as Richard slowly undid the top button of his dress shirt. His tie was already loosened. His eyes drifted to the floor indicator again. 17.5. The numbers didn't change. The red light above them cast a strange glow across his features. It made him look softer. Not younger, but less defined, like a sketch before it's been inked. She realized something, then something quiet and undeniable. He wasn't trying to get out. Of course, he had called for help. Of course, he had done what was reasonable. But now that they were suspended in time, cut off from obligations, from expectations, from scripted roles, he was content to wait. Claire had spent 5 years organizing his life. Appointments, flights, rehearsals, contracts. She knew what Richard Walker looked like when he was up against the clock. This wasn't that man. This man was at ease, still, watching her like someone who didn't mind being exactly where he was. She pressed her palms to her skirt, grounding herself. The walls of the elevator weren't tight, but they felt smaller with every breath. Not from claustrophobia, but from the closeness. The impossibility of pretending anymore. Claire glanced upward, letting her gaze follow the seam of the paneling where the ceiling met the wall. It was something to focus on. Something other than him. "Funny," she said, her voice quieter than before. "This building has 5 elevators, but we're in the only one still running this morning. The only one that glitched." Richard didn't answer right away. Then he murmured, "Or the only one that knew better." She blinked. "Excuse me?" He shook his head slightly, as if to wave away the comment. "Nothing. Just thinking out loud." But it wasn't nothing. Claire felt it in her chest, that shifting awareness, that slow, rising tide. They stood in silence for several more minutes, each pretending to give the other space. But the air in the elevator had changed. Not heavier, but more aware, more honest. Richard leaned against the mirrored wall, arms crossed loosely over his chest. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like a man in a waiting room, torn between 2 outcomes. Claire glanced at her phone, checking the time. 10:28 a.m. 90 minutes would put them at just past noon. Maybe later. The ceremony had been scheduled for noon sharp. Knowing Melissa and her family, that timeline would be sacred. She wondered how long the guests would wait before asking questions. She wondered if anyone would notice that the groom was missing. Her fingers toyed with the edge of her skirt, brushing away invisible lint. The quiet stretched. The red light continued its slow blink overhead, like a heartbeat. And then, Richard spoke. His voice was soft, thoughtful, not urgent. "Claire," he said, "if you were stuck in an elevator with someone, 1 hour before their wedding, who would you want that person to be?" Her breath caught. She turned her head toward him, slowly, her expression unreadable. The question sat between them, tender and heavy. Outside, the city buzzed, flowers were being delivered, vows were being rehearsed. But in here, on floor 17.5, something was beginning, or maybe finally being acknowledged. He came for a watch. Instead, he found something that had been buried for years. Richard's eyes were on the soft red glow above them, but Claire knew he wasn't really looking at it. His gaze had grown far away, like someone watching a memory replay in real time, except this one, she sensed, had no clear beginning or end. "I didn't come here for the watch," he said at last, his voice low, nearly carried away by the hum of the elevator fan. "I told myself that's what it was. I even looked in the drawer before I left the apartment, just to be sure it wasn't there. I knew it wasn't. I just needed an excuse." Claire didn't move. The words were too close to what she had begun to suspect, but hearing them said aloud shifted something in her chest, as if a tight string had suddenly gone slack. He turned toward her, leaning back slightly against the brass rail. "Melissa's family flew in 3 days ago," he continued. "Her father has been managing everything like it's a campaign strategy. Her mother redid the flower arrangements 3 times. Last night, I listened to my best man rehearse a toast that felt like a sales pitch for my own future. And all I could think was, I don't remember choosing this." Claire stared at him, her arms folded tightly, fingertips pressed into the crook of her elbow. Richard glanced down at his hands. They were clasped in front of him, unmoving. I needed silence. Not just the kind you hear, but the kind you feel. The kind I used to find when we worked late together. When you'd make a pot of coffee without asking, and I'd finally breathe. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Those nights had become chapters in her memory, small, private moments she'd never dared reread too often. She remembered the gentle scrape of ceramic mugs on her desk, the sound of Richard sighing when a paragraph finally made sense, the space between them humming with things unsaid. When did it become like this, he asked, but it was more to himself than to her. "I used to know what I wanted, or maybe I just thought I did." He paused, as if something within him hesitated. Then, more quietly, he said, "My mother. She died 4 years ago." Claire's heart stirred. She knew that already. She had sent the condolence arrangement, managed his travel schedule for the funeral, canceled 3 meetings without asking. But he'd never spoken about it, not until now. "She married for love," he said. "My father was a nobody when they met. No name, no inheritance, just ambition and a borrowed car. But she believed in him. She believed in love, in stories, in the long game." Claire said nothing. She was happy, I think. But later, when Dad died, and she had to carry the legacy alone, it wore her down. The board, the pressure, the expectations. I remember once, near the end, she told me, "Don't marry a dreamer, Richard. Marry someone practical, someone who fits the world you're in." His voice faltered. "She made me promise. Not in those exact words, but it was clear. She thought she had made her life harder by choosing love. She didn't want that for me." Claire's breath came shallow and quiet. Richard looked at her now, not through her, not past her, at her, and she felt herself bracing against the pull in his gaze. "She loved me," he said, "but she was tired, and I thought I was honoring her." Claire stepped back, just slightly. Enough that the edge of the elevator wall pressed gently into her shoulder. There were 1,000 things she could have said, that she understood, that expectations can masquerade as duty, that sometimes promises we make in grief become chains we carry long after the morning ends. Instead, she whispered, I used to imagine it. He tilted his head, just a fraction. She swallowed. You and me, not in the office, not behind schedules and strategy decks. I used to imagine you looking at me like I wasn't just your assistant. His eyes softened. I used to think, she went on, her voice tightening, that maybe, if I were the one standing beside you at that altar, I could have made you happy. Or, at least, helped you breathe again. The words landed gently, but they carried years with them. 5 years of silence, of longing packed into glances and half-finished sentences. Richard took a step toward her, not hurried, not forceful, like someone walking towards something that had always been just out of reach. Claire, he said, so softly it was almost lost to the whirring fan. It should have been you. She looked up at him, and for a moment, time didn't move. The sentence wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it cracked something open in her. Not the pain, the hope, a slow, aching hope that had curled itself into a corner of her heart and waited far too long to be acknowledged. She turned away, her hand finding the cool surface of the elevator wall, her fingers pressed against it as if it might steady her. Richard stood behind her, close, but not touching. She could feel his presence like warmth against her back. The air between them shifted charged with something both beautiful and unbearable. Then, gently, she felt the faintest movement, his hand reaching toward hers, and she stepped away. Don't, she said, her voice catching. Don't reach for me unless you're sure. He stopped, hand halfway between movement and stillness. Claire turned around to face him, her expression unreadable. I can't be a detour, she said quietly. Not a pause. Not the escape hatch on your way to somewhere else. If you take my hand, Richard, it has to be the only direction you want to go. They stood like that, words between them, silence folding in around the edges. Claire's heart pounded. The elevator light continued to blink overhead, slow and rhythmic, as if counting the seconds they had left before the world reclaimed them. And then Richard stepped back, not in retreat, but in understanding. Claire looked away, blinking hard. From somewhere far below, a faint metallic groan echoed upward. Maybe a technician working to free the car. Maybe time itself stirring again. But for now, the elevator remained still, suspended, as were they. Downstairs, a band played love songs. Upstairs, 2 hearts broke in silence. Somewhere below, in the trimmed gardens of the Charleston estate, guests gathered beneath white canopies, sipping champagne and dabbing at their eyes with lace-edged napkins. A string quartet rehearsed at last, as a florist fussed over the final arch of roses. The ceremony was set for 1 o'clock. Everything was ready except the groom. Inside the stalled elevator between floors 17 and 18, there was no music, just the faint hum of machinery and the distant sound of the emergency fan slicing through the still air. Claire leaned against the mirrored wall, her arms crossed tightly as if shielding herself from something she couldn't name. Across from her, Richard stood motionless, phone in hand, staring at the screen as if it had become too heavy to lift. The phone began to buzz. A call. Melissa. He hesitated, then pressed accept, holding the device to his ear. Melissa, he said quietly. Claire looked away. She didn't want to hear, but the elevator was a box of confessions now. There was nowhere to hide. Richard's voice was steady at first. I'm still at the office. The elevator, it stopped. We're stuck between floors. They say it could be another hour, maybe 2. The voice on the other end crackled. Claire could hear it even without words. The rising panic, the disbelief, the sharp edge of fear quickly morphing into fury. I know the ceremony's at 1. Yes, I understand. No, I can't climb out. The fire department says it's unsafe. The building's old, and the shaft is locked down. There was a pause. Then Melissa's voice grew louder, clearer, sharper. Claire closed her eyes. Richard's hand moved to the back of his neck, rubbing at the tension that seemed to be growing by the second. No, I'm not joking. Of course this isn't an excuse. Why would I make this up? His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Claire took a quiet step back, as if trying to fade into the walls. I was getting something. My father's watch. It wasn't in the house. I needed it. I just wanted to hold it for a while. Melissa said something else, something that made Richard wince. I know people are watching. I know what your father will think. Another pause, then a new sound, a text notification. Richard lowered the phone to glance at the screen. His face paled, without a word. He turned the device toward Claire. It was a message, just one line. Be there by 1 p.m., or it's over. The deal, the wedding, everything. Sen, Harrington. Claire's breath caught, not because she was surprised, but because she saw something shift in Richard's eyes. Not fear, not urgency, just resignation. He ended the call. The silence returned. Heavier now? Claire spoke first. You should go. Richard looked up, startled. They're waiting for you, she said. Your fiancé, her father, the guests, your company, they're all outside. I'm not... His jaw clenched. Don't tell me what I should do. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the elevator like a blade. Claire straightened. I'm just reminding you of the world you built, the one you're about to lose if you don't walk out that door. He laughed bitterly, almost a scoff. You really think I care about that right now? She hesitated. Yes, I think you care more than you want to admit. He stepped closer, eyes flashing. You are the reason I'm even questioning it. Claire's breath caught. Don't do that, she said softly. Don't put that on me. You think I planned this? He snapped. You think I wanted to feel this way about you for years and pretend it didn't exist? I never asked for that, she said. I never asked for any of it. No, he said, but you gave me something I couldn't forget. You looked at me like I was more than who I had to be. I saw you, she said simply, but I never claimed you. Silence again, thick, unbearable. Richard turned away, pressing his forehead against the cold steel wall. Do you know how many mornings I've woken up wondering what it would be like to choose something for myself? For once in my life, Claire didn't answer. My whole life has been planned out. Law school, hedge funds, mergers, marrying Melissa. It was all in the blueprint. And you were always the architect, Claire said. His shoulders sagged. I thought I had control, but I've been building someone else's house. He turned back to face her. For the first time, he looked broken. Tell me what to do. Claire shook her head. That's not my place. It is now? No, she said. Because whatever happens after this, whether you go down there or not, someone gets hurt. And I won't be the reason you destroy something you spent your life creating. Why not? He asked. Because I love you, she whispered. But I love myself too. And I can't be your mistake. His lips parted, but before he could say anything, the phone rang again. This time, he stared at it. Thomas. He murmured, my brother. He picked it up and put it on speaker. Rich, came the calm voice on the line. There's something you need to know, and I should have told you a long time ago. From the other side of the phone came not a threat, but a truth that set everything on fire. The speaker crackled slightly, and for a moment, it was just static. Then Thomas's voice came through clear, steady, like the kind of voice that never rushed into panic, but always arrived with purpose. Rich, he said, I need you to listen. Really listen. Richard stood motionless, the phone still on speaker. Claire hadn't moved either. They were like two statues carved by pressure, by longing, by years of everything unsaid. The Chicago deal went through. Thomas continued. Final signatures came in last night. We're secure. Brother, capital is locked. The expansion's funded. No conditions, no strings. Richard blinked. But that wasn't supposed to. I know. Thomas cut in gently. We thought they'd walk, but they didn't. Turns out, the pitch stood on its own. The numbers spoke loud enough. They want us, not Melissa's father. They want our brains, our model, our growth plan, not some shiny merger dressed in tulle. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Thomas kept going, his voice slower now, softer. I didn't tell you because you were already in it. The planning, the headlines, the pressure. You had blinders on, rich. And I didn't want to be the one to yank them off while you were halfway down the aisle. Richard didn't respond. He stared at the floor, at the phone, at Claire anywhere but inside himself. I'm telling you now, Thomas said, because you're stuck, literally. And sometimes being stuck is the only way we stop long enough to see. There was a pause. On the other end, the older brother's tone shifted something warmer, more human. Mom loved you so much, he said. You were always her heart. And I remember the day she told you to marry well. I remember how you swallowed that as duty. But rich. What she meant was marry someone who loves you well. Richard closed his eyes. She didn't want you trapped. She was never free herself. I watched her smile through a life that fit her like a wrong-size dress. Don't do that. Rich. Don't spend 40 years nodding politely through a life that doesn't feel like yours. Another pause. If there's someone else, Thomas said quietly, someone who makes you feel like yourself when no one else is watching, then don't let her go. Silence. Even the elevator seemed to fall still. Then the call ended. A soft click. No goodbye. Just truth. Left hanging in the air like the scent of smoke after a fire. Richard didn't move. Claire couldn't speak. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, willing herself to hold in the sob building behind her ribs. But one tear slipped out, quiet and uninvited. She turned her face toward the elevator wall, pretending to study the emergency instructions. Her shoulders trembled once barely, enough to feel, not enough to see. Because even now, even with the world bending at the edges, she didn't know what this meant. Even if Richard was free, even if the deal didn't need a wedding, even if no one was waiting anymore, would he choose her? Would he choose a woman who typed his meeting notes and memorized how he took his coffee? Would he choose the one who sat outside his door through years of silence, loyal, invisible, present? Or would freedom just make him run faster toward the life he already knew? Richard leaned against the paneling, the quiet surrounding them like snowfall. I don't know what to say, he finally whispered. You don't have to say anything, Claire murmured, not turning around. You should have time to think. I've had 5 years to think, he said, and I've done nothing with it. She nodded, though he couldn't see. More silence. Then, his voice, softer now. Claire, if I call it off, if I walk away from all of it, will you still be here? Her heart surged and then braced itself, because love that's held in secret too long becomes fragile. It wants to believe, it wants to leap, but it has learned how to ache in silence. She turned slowly to face him. Her voice was careful, steady, tender. That depends, she said. Will you be calling it off because you're finally choosing, or because you're simply too exhausted to keep pretending Richard's face flickered with something close to awe and fear? I don't want to pretend anymore, he said. Not with you, not with anyone. Claire took a step toward him, one small step, enough to hear the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in the tight space. I need you to be sure. Richard, she said quietly, because if I stay, I'm not hiding anymore. I'm not being the quiet girl at the edge of your world. He didn't answer right away, but in his eyes there was something changing. Not relief, not desperation, resolve. The elevator stayed silent, like it knew it had done its job. It had held two people still long enough for the truth to catch up. Downstairs, the music was still playing, But up here, time was rearranging itself. Claire looked down at her own hands, the same hands that had carried coffee cups and printed spreadsheets, that had shaken quietly while she typed out Richard's wedding vows, now folded gently in front of her chest, waiting, wondering, and hoping for once that maybe, just maybe, the next words would finally be the right ones. When the world around you is falling apart, sometimes the hardest question is, what do you want? The words hung in the air between them like a tightrope, stretched across 5 years of glances, silences, and choices neither of them had dared to make. Claire didn't answer right away. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her body remained still, but inside was a different story. A quiet storm had been waiting for this very moment, and now that it had come, she wasn't sure if she could withstand the stillness that followed. She looked down at her hands, resting gently in her lap. What did she want? She thought back to the first day she met Richard Walker 5 years ago in the interview room, when he wore a navy suit and had forgotten his pen. He'd asked for hers. She'd offered it with a hand that trembled slightly, though she had smiled to cover it. He'd returned it at the end of the meeting and said simply, "I hope you'll say yes." That had been the first time, but she hadn't realized then how many yeses she'd whispered quietly to herself. Yes, I'll stay late. Yes, I'll take that call. Yes, I'll be the one who remembers his mother's birthday, who keeps his favorite mints in the top drawer, who checks the weather before booking his flights. All the small yeses that no one ever saw. But this was the big one. This wasn't about staplers and lunch orders and perfectly aligned investor decks. This was about a life, her life. Richard slowly slid down the wall of the elevator and sat on the floor, knees drawn up, tie loose. The most powerful man she'd ever known looked like a boy lost in a world too loud for him. His head leaned back, eyes toward the ceiling, as if waiting for the answer to descend from somewhere higher than either of them. But Claire knew better. Some answers don't come from above. They rise from within. She knelt. Not close, but not far either. The air between them was thick with everything they hadn't said and the things they couldn't unsay now. She thought of all the moments she had chosen silence. The day she heard he was seeing Melissa. The week he was hospitalized for exhaustion. And she sat in the waiting room alone, telling the nurse she was just his assistant. The night he emailed her at 2 a.m. after a board meeting that had broken him, and she simply replied, "I'm here." She had always been here. But what she had never done was ask for him to see her. Really see her. She swallowed. "If you're going to choose love," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "choose it fully." He looked up, slowly. Her eyes didn't waver. "Don't ask me to stay unless you mean forever." There was no drama in her tone, no pleading, no trembling lip or dramatic pause. It was calm, but it was final. Because when you've loved in silence long enough, you learn the difference between a promise and a passing moment. Richard nodded once, slow, deliberate. He picked up his phone from beside him. His hands weren't as steady as they usually were. The fingers that signed million-dollar contracts now shook like a boy calling his first heartbreak. Claire watched. The call rang once, twice. Then Melissa answered. Claire couldn't hear what she said, just the tone, clipped and concerned. Richard cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he said. "You deserve the truth." There was a long pause. "I should have said this sooner. Maybe even before I asked you to marry me. But I didn't. And that's on me. I was trying to protect everything our families, the business, the story everyone already wrote for us." Claire didn't look away, though her chest ached. "I don't love you the way you deserve to be loved," Richard said quietly. "You deserve someone who wakes up thinking about you, not someone who feels trapped in a life he built for everyone but himself." He paused, listening. "Then I know this hurts, and I'm so sorry. But I can't walk into that ceremony pretending I don't know the truth anymore." Another pause. "No, there isn't someone else. There always was." Claire closed her eyes, not from shame, from the weight of the moment finally being real. The conversation ended not with shouting, but with silence. He held the phone in his lap after hanging up, eyes lowered. Claire didn't move. She wasn't sure how long they stayed like that. A few minutes, a lifetime, but something in the air had shifted, not just between them. Within them, he turned to her. "I don't know what happens now," he said quietly, "but I knew I had to start with the truth." She nodded. "Then that's something." And it was. Not everything, but something. Maybe even the beginning. Sometimes, endings don't explode. They unravel. Quietly. The elevator had fallen into a silence that didn't ask to be filled. Claire sat cross-legged in one corner, hands resting on her knees, her breath finally steady. Across from her, Richard held his phone with both hands, his thumbs hovering. The call with Melissa had ended, but its echoes lingered like the aftertaste of a bitter truth swallowed too late. He hadn't cried, and she hadn't screamed. Instead, the conversation had dissolved into silences, painful ones, weighted with memories they both knew wouldn't carry forward. Melissa had listened, for the most part, until he said the words that mattered most, that he didn't love her, that marrying her would be a kindness only in appearance, and cruelty in essence. And then, it happened, the long pause, the shift in her breath. "I thought I was imagining it," she finally whispered. "The way you'd look at her when you thought I wasn't watching." He didn't deny it. "And the way you'd sound lighter." God. Lighter after spending just a day working with her. She paused again. "I don't hate you, Richard. I want to, but mostly, I feel relieved that at least one of us was brave enough not to pretend anymore." When the call ended, Richard didn't move. Claire didn't speak. She simply watched as he closed his eyes, letting that first unraveling settle into his bones. Then came the second call, to her father. He was expecting fury. Instead, he got disappointment. "You had one job," the man snapped. "Keep your personal doubts to yourself. Appearances, Richard, that's what matters." "You think anyone cares about your feelings in a merger of this size?" "I care," Richard answered quietly. A silence followed. "Then you're not the man I thought you were." Click. That was it. No shouting, no threats of legal action, just cold dismissal. The kind that cuts deeper because it says you're no longer useful. Richard stared at the phone. One less chain, third call, to the wedding coordinator. Her voice was tight, professional, polished. He apologized, clearly and firmly. Explained that the event was canceled. No, not postponed, not rescheduled, canceled. There was a long pause before she responded. "I'll handle the vendors. I assume you'll take care of the press." "Yes, I hope you find what you're looking for." Fourth call, Thomas. The one person who wouldn't ask for explanations, who had already known. When Richard spoke, his voice cracked for the first time. "It's done," on the other end, a simple reply. "Good. You're not going to say I should have done it sooner. I don't need to. You did it now. That's all that matters." Richard exhaled a long, slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. After the fourth call, he sat back against the cool steel of the elevator wall. Claire hadn't said much, but her eyes had followed every word, every breath, every tremble in his hand. And when his phone buzzed again, a message this time, he turned the screen toward her. It was from Melissa. "I'm hurt, but thank you for not pretending." Claire read it, then looked at him. A silence followed, but this one was different. Not heavy, not tense. It was open. He looked around at the metal walls that had witnessed a transformation no conference room ever could. Then he looked at her. "Now," he said slowly, "what do we build next?" Claire didn't reply. Not in words. She smiled, and as if on cue, the elevator shuddered once, then again, a mechanical whir, a click. The doors creaked open. She stood first, then turned, and without saying a word, she offered him her hand. He took it, not like a man clinging to something fragile, but like a man choosing his next step with intention. Together, they stepped out, into whatever came next. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't arrive like a thunderclap or an applause. It comes in quiet mornings. The sound of a coffee mug set gently on the counter, a breeze through open windows, two people learning how to breathe beside each other, not in the rush of longing, but in the steadiness of love finally given space to grow. 6 months had passed since the elevator doors opened. Not a single tabloid got their story right. Most of them didn't bother following up after the initial wave of scandal subsided. A billionaire CEO cancels his high society wedding an hour before the vows. Yes, it was a headline. But in a world obsessed with drama, when the couple that followed refused to play into the theatrics, interest faded fast. Richard and Claire chose silence, not in the sense of avoidance, but in reverence. They didn't rush into another wedding. In fact, they didn't plan one at all. There were no registries, no invitations, no towering cakes. What they did plan was breakfast. Every morning, together, 2 mugs, 1 kettle, her favorite chair pulled closer to the window. Walter, her aging Labrador mix, lying sprawled across both their feet like a bridge. Their days were ordinary, but never dull. One afternoon, while walking along the narrow path near the Charleston shore, Claire mentioned something she'd read weeks earlier about the number of women in their 50s laid off during the pandemic who never re-entered the workforce. Not because they couldn't, but because no one believed in them anymore. Richard listened. 3 weeks later, he handed Claire a folder. Inside were legal documents, grant proposals, and a foundation charter ready to be signed, the name of the foundation, the Eleanor Grant Initiative. Claire's fingers trembled as she traced the name. Eleanor had been Richard's mother, a woman who gave up her law degree to support her husband's business ventures, who died with regret in her voice. Despite decades of loyalty, the initiative would fund scholarships, training programs, mentorships for women over 40 returning to the job market. It was bold, it was necessary, and it was hers. "You'll run it," Richard had said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, and she did. They rented a modest brick building near the edge of the historic district. Sunlight spilled into the office through large, old-fashioned windows. Claire filled it with warmth, soft-toned walls, a quiet reading corner, a community board where women pinned their dreams. Above her desk hung a photo of Eleanor, young and confident in her cap and gown. Life settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with walks by the beach, sometimes quiet, sometimes filled with gentle teasing about who snored louder or who made the better French toast. Evenings were for books, board games, and the kind of laughter that comes only when the heart feels safe. Walter had, in every sense, become their dog. Richard, once known for working through every holiday, now insisted on taking Sundays off. He found peace in small routines, watering the ferns on their front porch, brewing Claire's tea just the way she liked, memorizing the squeaky spots on their hardwood floor to avoid waking her during her early morning journaling. He still worked. Of course he did. But now his schedule made space for joy. One late summer morning, Claire returned from the local farmer's market, her hands full of fresh basil and peaches, to find a small box on the kitchen table. Inside was a brass key with a note, "Not to my heart. You already have that. This one opens the office next door to mine. CEO, Eleanor Grant Initiative, if you'll have the job." The next day, she unlocked her new office. A plaque with her name was already mounted beside the door. Later that week, they took a quiet walk back to the building where, 6 months earlier, everything had changed. The elevator had been repaired, of course, polished. The emergency lights were gone, replaced by soft ambient bulbs. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and new wiring. Claire stood in the center, her fingers grazing the side panel. "It's odd," she said softly, "how something so small, a power surge, a missed appointment can change everything." Richard stood beside her, their shoulders brushing. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked up at the ceiling, the place he had once stared at while feeling everything fall apart. Then, at her. She had changed, too. She stood straighter now, her eyes brighter. There was less hesitation in her gestures, more conviction in her quiet, and him, he was no longer running, not from expectation, not from feelings, not from himself. He took her hand, gently, as if asking permission once again. That day, he said, voice calm and sure, it didn't break us, it built us. Claire didn't reply. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Outside the elevator, the world moved as always, people rushing, phones ringing, cars honking, but inside, it was still, not the stillness of being stuck, but the kind that comes from finally being grounded. Together, they had settled into a life that felt more like home than any place either had known. Their days unfolded in soft tones, paper rustling, the scrape of chair legs, the way Claire sometimes hummed under her breath when she cooked. Richard never spoke over the music. He just listened. By all definitions, they were already married. The legalities didn't matter much, not to them. They shared bills, burdens, and bacon in the mornings. They knew the rhythm of each other's silences. Walter now answered to both their voices. Their toothbrushes stood side by side in a ceramic holder she made during a weekend pottery class. But some promises deserved to be said out loud. It was a Sunday, crisp, with the Charleston sun gentle through wisps of cloud. The kind of day that makes you breathe slower, as if the world wants you to notice the way the wind bends the branches or how the pine needles crackle underfoot. Richard suggested a walk through Hampton Park, a route they often took when the air felt too still in the house. Claire didn't question it. She laced up her sneakers, zipped her fleece, and tugged Walter's leash from its hook. They moved like old dancers, her pace always slightly ahead, his stride steady, letting her lead. Walter ambled along, occasionally stopping to sniff patches of grass as if they held national secrets. Their conversation was light. She told him about a woman at the foundation who just got her first job offer in 9 years. He told her about a potential partnership with a nonprofit in Atlanta. Nothing earth-shattering, just the kind of talk you share when your hearts are already known to each other. But when they reached the old sycamore near the south bend of the path, Richard stopped. It was the same tree they had sat beneath months ago, when everything still felt uncertain and raw. Their first picnic, just hummus, crackers, and grapes. She had cried that day not because she was sad, but because she finally felt safe enough to let it out. Claire turned to him now, her brow furrowed in gentle curiosity. "You okay?" she asked. Richard nodded, but he didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, navy blue velvet box. No grand gestures, no dramatic pauses. Just a quiet movement, as simple and significant as the man himself. Claire blinked. Once. Twice. He opened the box. Inside was a ring delicate, with a single pearl flanked by 2 small diamonds. No flash, no towering stone, just something timeless. Something that felt like her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world didn't pause. No birds fell silent. A jogger passed behind them, oblivious. A couple on a bench laughed softly, but in Claire's chest, the moment cracked something open. Richard didn't kneel. He simply held the box between them, his hands trembling just enough that she could see how much this mattered. And then, his voice rough with emotion, but clear as ever. "This isn't because we need it to feel real. You've been my partner every day since that elevator. Maybe even before. But I don't want another day to pass without asking you. Out loud. The way I should have the first time." His eyes didn't waver. "Will you marry me?" Claire stared at him. Lips parted but no sound formed. Her throat felt too tight. Not from surprise, but from the weight of the question. From how long she'd wanted it, feared it, and finally felt ready for it. The ring was beautiful. But it wasn't that. It was the look in his eyes, that certainty, that stillness. The same steadiness he gave her every time life threatened to unravel. The same steadiness she learned to offer back. Tears came, but quietly. Not the cinematic kind, with heaving shoulders and mascara running. Just a few drops that caught the afternoon light and slipped past her smile. She closed the box gently, not out of refusal, but reverence. Then she stepped forward, wrapped both arms around him, and whispered into his ear, "Yes." He exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath for months. But she wasn't finished. She pulled back, just far enough to see his face. And again, she said, and again, and again. Richard laughed softly, the kind of laugh people reserve for church pews and newborns full of awe. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had always belonged there. They didn't kiss right away. They stood still, forehead to forehead, wrapped in something older than words. A promise made not just in this moment, but in every moment before it, where they chose kindness over pride, honesty over comfort, each other over escape. Walter, sensing the emotion, whined and pressed his head against their legs. Claire chuckled through her tears and knelt to scratch behind his ears. "Well," she said, glancing at Richard, "I guess he approves. I would have reconsidered if he didn't." She smiled, standing again. They walked the rest of the path slowly, fingers interlaced. There were no phone calls to make, no press releases, no event planners to consult. Just two people who had finally spoken aloud what they had known all along. Love, they'd learned, doesn't always need an announcement, but sometimes it deserves one. Some stories don't end with heartbreak. They just need time to become the right kind of love. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when the postcard arrived tucked between a grant renewal letter and a coupon flyer from the neighborhood hardware store. Claire noticed it immediately, not because of the stamps from London or the elegant handwriting, but because something about the energy of it felt personal. She turned it over slowly. The image was of a cobblestone street in Notting Hill, with flower boxes overflowing onto painted windowsills. And there, standing in the center of the frame, smiling, radiant, and unmistakably at peace, was Melissa. Not the Melissa Claire remembered in sharp suits and tighter smiles. Not the poised publicist with perfect posture, performing composure for the world's applause. This Melissa was barefoot, in a linen dress, hair unpinned and falling over her shoulders. Beside her stood a tall man with kind eyes and laugh lines, holding her hand as if she were the rarest thing he'd ever been entrusted with. Claire ran her thumb gently across the edge of the card. The message on the back was handwritten in dark blue ink. "Claire, I wasn't sure I should send this, but I think you'll understand better than anyone. His name is Julian. He plays the piano in a little jazz bar near the Thames. No business ties, no boardrooms, just music and burnt toast and someone who lets me be small when I need to be. We're getting married next spring, somewhere quiet. I don't need it to be big, I just need it to be true. I hope you're well. I really do." Melissa Claire didn't cry. She smiled small, private, and real. She sat down at her desk in the corner of their shared home office, sunlight spilling across the wood like it always did in the late afternoon. Her fingers brushed the photograph again, pausing at Melissa's eyes. They held none of the guarded edge Claire used to see in meetings or formal dinners. Just light, just ease. It struck Claire then not as a pang of jealousy, not even as relief, but as gratitude. Gratitude that none of them had chosen the easy thing. Gratitude that none of them had clung to the version of life everyone else expected them to perform. She had once feared that her presence had broken something, but now she could see it more clearly. What had broken was the illusion, the performance, the plan someone else had written for all of them. Melissa had been brave enough to step away from a life that would have looked perfect on paper, but hollow in practice. Richard had been brave enough to admit his truth, even when it cost him. And Claire had been brave enough to stay in the elevator, not to run, and to believe that, maybe, love didn't have to be loud or dramatic to be real. She reached for her journal, the one with the leather binding and soft pages she reserved for things that mattered. Tucking the postcard into the back pocket, she paused for a moment, then wrote a single sentence beneath today's date. Everyone deserves to be chosen for love, not convenience. The words felt right, not profound, not poetic, just right. She closed the journal slowly and sat back in her chair. Outside, the sky had begun to shift dusky purple clouds curling into the soft orange of sunset. In the distance, she heard the rustle of Richard coming down the hall, the familiar sound of his steps paired with the soft clink of ceramic. He entered the room quietly, setting a cup of chamomile tea beside her without saying a word. She didn't have to look to know he'd added just a hint of honey, exactly how she liked it. His hand rested gently on her shoulder, warm and steady. Claire reached up and covered it with her own. They didn't talk about the postcard. They didn't need to. In this house, in this version of their lives, silence wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Richard leaned down, kissed the top of her head, and lingered just a little longer than usual. Claire sipped her tea. She thought about how different things might have been if she'd spoken sooner, if he hadn't gotten into the elevator that morning, if Melissa had fought harder, or not at all. But she didn't stay long in those thoughts, because this moment, this stillness, this warmth, this right here wasn't built on what could have been. It was built on what was. A love that hadn't arrived in fireworks or wedding bells, but one that had stayed, grown, healed, and in a drawer just beside her desk, tucked among old receipts and forgotten paper clips, sat a photograph of another woman, one who had once stood in the shadows of expectations and sacrifice. Melissa was no longer a chapter Claire felt guilty reading. She was simply part of the story. And some stories, especially the ones that don't end in heartbreak, deserve to be remembered. Some elevators take you to a floor, others take you to your forever. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the Charleston skyline, casting long golden streaks across the sidewalks and windows of Walker and Lane's main building. The glass facade shimmered like a memory, familiar, distant, and slightly softened by time. Claire stood at the base of the steps, holding a slim envelope with an embossed seal. Inside it was a letter short, formal, heartfelt. It would be read aloud in a few minutes. Upstairs, in front of a small gathering of mentors, scholars, and the first recipient of the Eleanor Grant Women's Resilience Scholarship. But, for now, she was still. Richard stepped beside her, buttoning his navy blazer. He hadn't worn a tie, he rarely did these days, but there was still something dignified about the way he carried himself. Not because of power, but peace, as if, finally, he had nothing left to prove. "Ready?" he asked gently. Claire nodded, but her eyes drifted upward to the 27th floor, the floor where it had all begun, and, in a way, the floor where it had all come undone. They walked through the lobby slowly, greeting familiar faces, nodding to the receptionist who now smiled with something more than obligation. Time had passed, but it hadn't erased the echoes. It had softened them. As they reached the elevator bank, Claire paused. The elevator doors were sleek, now replaced in brushed steel with updated panels, safety sensors, and soft ambient lighting. No longer the flickering fluorescent light she remembered. No longer the box of unspoken truths and fragile breathing. Richard noticed her hesitation, but didn't rush her. Instead, he pressed the button. A soft chime, a pause, then the doors slid open without drama or hesitation. They stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lemon and oak. The lights were warm, not clinical. Someone had even placed a small framed quote in the corner panel. "Sometimes, getting stuck is just life's way of making sure you stop and listen." Claire read it, her lips curling into a knowing smile. Richard caught her expression. "Do you ever think, what if we never got stuck?" She didn't answer immediately. The door slid shut. The hum of the elevator began its quiet ascent. Then, softly, "Then maybe we'd still be stuck," she said. "Just not in that elevator." He looked at her. She looked back, and they both smiled small, private, certain. There was no weight in the silence, no looming confession or buried truth. just the comfort of two people who had walked through fire and came out hand in hand. The elevator didn't jolt this time. No emergency buzzers, no blinking lights. Just a smooth rise through the floors, past all the places they had once lost themselves in roles and silence. As the numbers blinked 15, 16, 17, Claire reached for his hand. He laced his fingers with hers, instinctively. It struck her, in that moment, not how much had changed, but how much they had changed. Months ago, this very space had been a threshold between duty and desire, between masks and truth. Now, it was just a vessel, just steel and wires and motion. The transformation had been inside them. The elevator dinged softly at floor 27. They stepped out. A small podium had been set near the window wall, where the golden light poured in like praise. Chairs were arranged neatly, a table of name tags, and at the center, a young woman stood in a pressed blouse and second-hand shoes, her eyes bright, but unsure. Claire smiled at her. This was who the scholarship was for. Not for perfection, not for promise, but for possibility. Claire delivered her speech with poise, thanking the donors, the committee, and the names no longer here to receive the applause. She mentioned Eleanor, her strength, her sacrifice. She spoke not as the woman who had once sat alone behind a CEO's desk, but as someone who had learned that worth wasn't proven by titles, but by truth. After the applause, there were photos, hugs, and more of those quiet congratulations that meant more than any headline. Eventually, the crowd thinned. Claire and Richard lingered by the same window she had once stared through, while the wedding car pulled up 6 months before. It feels lighter now, she murmured. Richard nodded. It's because you're not carrying everything alone anymore. She didn't reply, just rested her head briefly against his shoulder. They took the elevator down again. As the doors slid shut, Claire caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. For a moment, she paused. The woman looking back at her wasn't the same woman who had once waited in silence, loving someone from a distance. This version of her stood taller, not in height but in presence. Her eyes didn't dart away. Her shoulders didn't curl inward. She didn't shrink herself to make room for others anymore. This woman was chosen, not because it was convenient, but because it was right. And as the elevator descended, smooth and steady, she didn't wish it had been her anymore. It already was. Sometimes, life gives us detours not to delay us, but to awaken us. This story is not just about missed weddings or broken elevators. It's about the quiet moments that ask us, are we really living the life we want, or just the one we think we should? For 5 years, Claire and Richard lived in parallel close, yet never fully reaching, out of duty, out of fear, out of timing. But when the world paused, when they were forced to sit still in a box between floors, they finally saw each other. And more importantly, they saw themselves. The real lesson, love doesn't always arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in honesty, in presence, in choosing again this time with courage. If you've ever loved in silence, hesitated out of fear, or waited too long to speak your truth, this story is your gentle reminder. It's never too late, not to choose differently, not to begin again, not to be chosen for real and fully. So, take the detour, pause, ask the hard questions. And if love shows up no matter how late, open the door. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, made you reflect, or reminded you of something you've been quietly holding inside, then it was worth telling. We believe in the power of stories to heal, connect, and inspire. If you felt something today, please like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak to the soul. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter.